Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the final day of action and the FIDE World Rapid Championship being held in Samarkand in the country of Uzbekistan. Now going into this final day, Magnus Carlsen, the former world chess champion, is trying to defend his title as the best rapid player in the world. Now recently he won the Chess Champions Tour, which in and of itself was an amazing accomplishment, but in this open field featuring more than 150 players, let's see if he could continue. So Magnus started off the event, which is 13 rounds over 3 days, with a draw in round 1. He would win 5 games in a row to move to 5.5 points out of 6. He had 3 draws, which left him standing on 7 points out of 9. He was tied for the lead with Yu Yang and Vidit Santos Gujarati going into the final day with 4 rounds to be played. So let's jump right into the action with round number 10, with Magnus playing against Vladimir Fedoseev, who is a very strong player from Russia. So first game of the day, we get the move d4 being played here by Fedoseev. Magnus now plays the move knight to f6. We get c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and now Fedoseev plays the move knight f3. Now when I was doing my live commentary on my Kick channel, I mentioned how this knight f3 variation is something that I have a great affinity for. I played this all the way back in 2011 in the Tata Steel event being held in the city of Vaikonze, and one of the reasons I played this is because at the time I had started working with Garry Kasparov, the famous former world chess champion, and I played this system with some great success. I believe that I beat Ruslan Ponomarev, Alexander Grishuk, and Drew Vishyanand with it, so it brings back a lot of memories. Now here, Magnus plays the move bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and d6. And one thing that I cannot stress enough about Magnus's approach in this event is understanding one of the key fundamental differences between classical chess and rapid chess. Now, in a classical game, this variation with bishop takes c3 is probably considered to be a little bit dubious, but one of the things that Magnus understands about rapid chess, which is quite different, is a lot of the moves that you're looking for in rapid chess are moves where you can play very, very quickly. You don't have to spend a lot of time. And what that does, if you have easier plans than your opponent, you move quickly, they get low on time, they have less time to think, more chances for big blunders to occur. So we get queen c2, Magnus goes queen e7, and you're probably wondering, well, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that here Magnus intends to play e5 or c5, develop his knight, castle the king one way, or respond accordingly based on what white does, whereas white on the other hand does not have obvious ideas right off. It's not clear. Do you go e4? Do you play g3? Do you play bishop g5? White has to think a little bit more than black does, and so you're hoping that you can get your opponent low on time. And Magnus is of course very confident in his abilities to get out of trouble even if his opponent knows the best way to play. So we get a4 being played here by Fedoseev. Now we get c5 from Magnus. The move e4 is played. Magnus goes e5, clogging up the light square diagonals here. Here you'll notice his light square bishop has no squares. Even if it gets to d3 here, the pawns are in the way. There's literally no scope whatsoever. So after bishop d3, actually bishop d3 was not played, we get d5 being played here. Magnus goes knight bd7. We get h4 being played by Fedoseev. We have h6 here. Now h4 is a move that might look a little bit weird on first glance because white has pushed both the a and the h pawns, meaning that the king in the center is going to struggle to castle either to the queen side or the king side. On the other hand, however, the center part of the board here is very clogged like a toilet. Both sides have these pawn formations here, and the king is very safe in the middle of the board. And additionally, in the long term, white wants to keep an eye on this h6 pawn with the dark square bishop from c1. So we get bishop to e2 here. Magnus plays king to d8. Now this is a very logical move too, because if Magnus tries to castle out of the center here, white can play moves like knight d2 followed by g4 and g5, and very, very quickly white is going to be attacking on the king side. So Magnus plays king d8 here, running the king over to c7, and with all these pawn clumps in the way, the king should be very safe. So we have knight d2. Magnus goes king c7 here, and now we have the move knight to f1. Magnus plays g6. We get g4 being played, and now the move a5. Now the computer was wanting Magnus to play a5 for many moves, and the reason the computer wanted Magnus to play a5 is because if black tries to play b6 and go bishop b7, white can play a5 here, and now white is trying to push pawns on both sides of the board and open up various files for the two towers on h1 and a1. So Magnus goes a5. Now white will not be able to push the a pawn. It also keeps another diagonal closed for the light square bishop on e2 to use. So we get h5 here. Computer really does not like this move. It actually thinks that here white should play a move like bishop to e3 followed by knight g3. But one of the things is that for Magnus, even if the computer thinks that white might be a little bit better here, it's much easier for him to play the position because he has to react to whatever white's moves are. So for example, after a move like bishop to e3, he can go knight to f8 or knight b6, but he doesn't really have a lot of options. You can't really move the rooks. Even if you go b6, bishop doesn't have any access on the diagonal, and for that reason, with limited options in terms of what to play, Magnus can do limited calculations, use less time, and try to get his opponent low on the clock. Now Fedoseev here plays the move h5. Magnus trades the pawns. He does not go g5 trying to clog the king side, because now after knight to e3, white eventually has knight to f5. There are ideas like rook b1 and queen b3, and black simply has no activity. So we get g takes h5, g takes h5. Magnus now plays the move knight to b6, trying to open up the scope for the light square bishop here, and additionally pressuring the pawns on a4 and c4. The game continues with knight to g3. We get bishop d7 being played here by Magnus. We have the move queen to b3, and now we get this move knight to e8. Now computer is not a big fan of white's position, and the reason is that in the long term, black can maneuver and try to play for f5. Meanwhile, where is white's king going? Black can also go rook g8, and with all these different ideas in play for black, it seems like black should have an advantage. Additionally, in a rapid game specifically, white has to use time here, whereas Magnus's ideas will be dictated by whatever setup Fedoseev comes up with. For example, if Fedoseev goes rook b1, you go rook a6 to guard the knight. Now the a4 pawn is weak. If Fedoseev plays something like bishop e3, you go knight g7 and f5 next turn. And if white were to play, say, f4, this is where we talk about reacting. Now you go rook g8 to pressure the knight on g3. So Fedoseev has to use time trying to figure out what exactly his idea is, whereas Magnus's moves are going to be pure reactions to whatever he does. And for that reason, Fedoseev will have to use more time, Magnus will use less time, and that gives you this added component of trying to win the game on the clock. So we do get bishop e3 from Fedoseev. Magnus plays knight g7, trying to go for f5 and open up the f file. We have the move king to d2 played here, and now we get this move f5. We get pawn takes, knight takes, and now Fedoseev makes a very strange decision by playing this move rook b1. Now this is a big mistake here, and it might not be obvious on first glance why this is not the right move, but what Fedoseev should have done is simply trade the knights on f5 and played rook to g1 here, trying to claim the g file. If black plays rook g8, then you hang this pawn on h6, and after queen h4, bishop e3, it looks very scary on first glance, but the bishop on e2 holds both of these pawns. You can also push h6 down the road, and black also has to worry about this move rook a to b1. So after knight takes f5, Fedoseev instead plays this move rook to b1, and this is a very serious inaccuracy, because now after rook to a6, guarding the knight on b6, knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, white has a very tough decision to make. Does white go rook g1, which is a move here, or does white play rook b2 like in the game? Now the big difference with this position versus the other one is after rook g1, you're like, well, it looks very similar. What's the difference? The difference is that now after rook to b1, rook to g1, black can play bishop d7, hitting the pawn here on a4, and you will have to go back to a1 guarding, whereas in the previous variation you had a rook on g1 and the black rook was on a8. Additionally here, black can also play this move knight to d7, trying to activate the rook on the b file here, and white is definitely struggling. So after bishop takes f5, Fedoseev plays this move rook b2. We now get this move queen g7, an excellent move from Magnus for a couple of reasons. He guards the pawn on h6 with the queen. He also controls the g file, and he intends to play rook g8 down the road as well. So we get queen to d1 being played, and now you'll also notice that this rook on b2 is terrible. It can't get back to the back rank easily because this bishop on f5 always covers a square. And so now if you can't bring the rook back around very quickly, this rook on b2 is simply useless because it looks like it creates threats on the b file, but it's just actually doing nothing at all. So we have queen to d1 being played. Magnus goes rook to g8, stopping white from claiming the g file, and now we have the move king c1. After king c1, Magnus plays queen h7, another amazing move here, because what he does is he sidesteps on the file. The queen still guards the pawn here, but now he intends to infiltrate on this g file with the rook on g8. We get rook to a2 being played. Magnus goes knight d7, and now you'll notice that this rook on a2 is terrible. This rook really should be somewhere like on the king side, but instead it's way off sides on a2. Additionally, Magnus intends to bring the knight over, eventually bring the other rook back, and white's position here is in serious danger. So we get the move rook to b2 back, stopping rook b6. Magnus plays knight to f6. We get rook to g1, and now rook takes rook, queen takes, and rook to a8 back. Now what has happened here is that Magnus is going to put the rook on g8, claim this open file. Meanwhile, white has these bishops which really are not very good. Light square bishop very, very passive here. Dark square bishop not doing a whole lot either. So now f4 is played by Fedoseev, and this is a move that sort of reeks of desperation. Because in this position, what Fedoseev is trying to do with f4 is if Magnus were to play the move e4, white can sack the bishop on c5, and suddenly after takes, white is crashing through on the queen side here. If you go king b8, there's queen d6 to collect the knight. If you go king d7, there's rook takes b7. Spaghetti-o, you lose the queen on h7. But Magnus goes rook g8, and now you get queen to h2 and this move e4. And now what has happened is white's bishop on e2 is still very passive, guarding the two pawns, but now the bishop on e3 can't do anything because both of the diagonals are closed. Back here in this position, the bishop is always spying the pawn, but when we get to this position after e4, now there's no scope towards the pawn on h6, which means that white's two b's here are very, very passive on e3 and e2. So we get rook b1 being played by Fedoseev. Magnus plays queen d7, shifting over to go after the pawn. We have bishop to d1 guarding the pawn on a4, bishop g4, bishop c2, and now Magnus plays the move queen to f5. Fedoseev goes king b2, we get bishop takes h5, and now this move rook to e1 is played. And at least in this position, now Fedoseev has some chances because the pawn on e4 can be targeted once white moves the bishop away. You can't easily move the bishop without losing the pawn on h6, so at least temporarily it feels like Fedoseev has some chances. Magnus plays b6, and now Fedoseev plays this horrible move king to b3. What Fedoseev should have played here was bishop to c1, retreating the bishop to put pressure on the pawn on e4, and sort of asking black what is he going to do in this position, because all black's pieces are kind of tied down to the current squares. If you move the bishop, you always hang the pawn on h6. If you move the knight, then I just move the queen. You could hang the pawn on e4. Even queen e7 is an idea here, and it starts to become very dangerous. So instead, Fedoseev plays this move king to b3. Now Magnus has time to go rook g6, guarding the pawn, and on the next turn he's going to move the bishop to f3. We get the move queen to h1. Rook to g3 is played, not bishop f3 by the way, because then white can sack the queen temporarily, and after takes, we trade off queens, but white has two b's versus one knight, and white should win the game. So we get rook g3 from Magnus. Queen h4 is played, we get rook to h3, queen to f2, and now after bishop to f3, the rook on h3 guards the bishop from being captured. Black can go knight g4 next move, and the rest is simply hopeless. So the game continues with rook g1, knight g4 played by Magnus to shut down the g file here. We have queen to e1, now h5 is played, and you'll notice that all of white's pieces are so passive. Bishop on f3 guards everything, it stops anything from happening on the light squares. Knight targets the bishop, pawn supports knight, rook can go to h2, and black is positionally winning. Fedoseev plays bishop c1, we get rook to h2, queen g3 played, and now the move bishop e2. Another very nice touch from Magnus with the idea of pressuring the pawn on c4 or going bishop d3 to trade off the light square b, because white is going to be left with this absolutely horrible bishop that has no scope on the dark squares. We have rook e1, Magnus goes bishop takes c4, king takes, rook takes bishop. Black has two extra pawns here. Terrible bishop on c1, weak king on c4, and the game wraps up very quickly. After queen h4, we get king d7, stopping white from entering on e7. Bishop e3, we get rook g2, queen h1, rook g3, forcing the bishop to move. We have bishop c1, knight to f6, rook d1 played, trying to guard the pawn on d5. Rook d3 played here by Magnus, forcing exchange of rooks. We get the trade, and now with the bad bishop, black having the wide peepos, the game is over. We have king b5, queen d5, queen h3, king c7, c4 played, and after queen c6, king a6, and b5. Vladimir Fedoseev resigns in this position because if he moves the king to a5, queen b6 is mate. If you go to a7, queen b7 would also be checkmate. So a masterful performance from Magnus to win this game and move to 8 out of 11 in the tournament. Simply a game where Magnus, even though he played something that was a little bit dubious, became very much about maneuvering. He understood the concepts, the plans a little bit better. His opponent was also a little bit slower, and Magnus shows why in rapid chess specifically, you have to mix it up. Sometimes you play lines that aren't the absolute best, because if you get to a position where you have to calculate, you have to maneuver and just play the game, Magnus ultimately believes that he's better than anyone else, and in this game, he definitely proves it. So Magnus on 8 points out of 11, and now in 8 points out of 10, sorry, I should say. And now in the 11th round, he's playing with the white pieces against Puya Idani from Iran. Now, Puya Idani is a 2600 player, very strong player, having a very, very good turn, the turn of his life going into this round. He's 7.5 points out of 10, half point out of the lead, and he's playing against Magnus. So Magnus opens with e4 here. We get c5 from Idani, knight f3, d6, and now Magnus plays bishop c4. Now it's a very logical approach from Magnus. Again, trying to avoid mainline theory. And what I mean by that is Puya Idani is a player who's played many strong players in the World Cup. He came very close to defeating Jan-Krzysztof Duda, I believe, last year. Very, very good theoretician. But when you play moves like bishop c4 and d3, White's ideas are very simple. You want to castle, play h3, develop the knight, make sure that you never lose this light square bishop. And so you get to go boom, boom, boom with the first 8 to 10 moves without having to think. And additionally, your opponent does not have theory to support them, so it should favor the stronger player. So we get g6, castles played by Magnus, bishop g7. Now we have a4 being played. A4 move to create squares for the light square bishop to retreat, but also to stop black from playing a6 and b5, taking space. We get castles, c3. Now we have knight to c6. Magnus plays h3 here to stop bishop g4, pinning the knight. Very important, by the way, because if black were to play bishop g4 right away, you're probably wondering, well, what's the big deal? And here you can go knight bd2, and after knight c6, h3 takes, you get this great knight on f3, and you're pushing for d4 in a couple of moves. Whereas in the game, we go back here after knight to c6 when he plays h3. What you're doing here is you're stopping bishop g4, you're creating luft here, but additionally you don't want to hurry with knight bd2, because if you play knight bd2, now after a move like e6, your bishop on c1 is underdeveloped, and it's a little bit better for black. Additionally, if you play a move like bishop e3, bishop g4, now you don't really have time. If you go h3, takes knight e5, I fork the queen and the bishop, and I will trade for the bishop on c4, and you'll be left with these ugly double pawns on c3 and c4. And if you play this move knight b to d2 here, now black can play knight to e5, hitting the bishop and the knight at the same time, and black should be completely fine. So Magnus plays h3, we get d5 from Idani, takes, rook to e1, and now the move b6 is played here. A very logical move, because in this position, black wants to finish the development, and the light square bishop, where does it go? It can't go to g4. You could maybe go to f5 here, but after knight h4, the bishop has to go back home. And so if you can't really develop it easily on this diagonal, then the obvious idea is to fianchetto it and put pressure towards the knight on f3. We get knight bd2, e6 played, and now Magnus goes knight b3. We get bishop to b7, and Magnus plays his move bishop g5. Here Idani plays queen c7, and now we have d4. Now the reason Magnus plays d4 here is that white has these slightly weak pawns on c3 and d3. d3 specifically is a backwards pawn to some degree, and white wants to get rid of this weakness. And when you play d4 here, you're trying to retreat the bishop, maybe get a knight to the center, maybe put a rook on the c file, and so it makes a lot of sense. Idani plays knight ce7 here, protecting the pawn on c5. We get the move queen to e2, and now we have h6, bishop d2, and Idani goes knight f4. Now this opening has gone very, very well for black. For Idani specifically, he's feeling very good about himself. Magnus has to trade, and now black has the classic two bishops, or the bees/bishop pair, as we like to affectionately call them. So Magnus is not in good shape here. He plays move knight to e5. Idani goes knight to f5, trying to pressure the central pawn on d4, but also maybe intending to go knight to h4 or queen to g5. We get the move queen g4. Idani trades the queens and goes knight d6. Magnus plays bishop f1. We get takes, and now the move bishop d5. Now at this point, it's going really, really well for Puya Idani here. He has the two bishops. And we're in an endgame. Generally, the bishops have scope. The knights on d4 and e5, not really great. White also has the double pawns on g2 and g4. So surely he'll be able to at least draw this. Now, we do know Magnus, of course, being the wizard of endgames, anything can happen. So let's see. Magnus plays a5 here, and now Idani makes a huge mistake by trading the bishop for the knight on e5. Now this is a move that is just simply bad, and one thing that I like to say to people, especially stronger players who are watching my streams specifically or these YouTube videos, is sometimes it's really, really important to think about concepts as opposed to doing pure calculations. And I think this is a very good example where sometimes you need to just step back and think about your position and think about what are your advantages and what are your opponent's advantages. Now in this position, after a move like rook to c8, for example, in this position, stopping a knight from jumping to c6, black should be completely fine. This knight on e5 is always under pressure here, so white doesn't really have time to say stack the rooks on the a file, because then you lose the knight. So knight is unsecured here on e5. It's always a weakness. and there's really no reason to trade off the bishop. Now, my assumption about this position is that Idani probably saw this position, and without thinking about concepts or basic plans, he thought that in this position he really needed to simplify right away as opposed to simply trying to improve his position. It's really important to think about concepts. What are your advantages? What are the pieces that are on the best squares? Things like this, as opposed to trying to do pure calculations and just calculate individual moves one by one. I think that's something that's really, really important to keep in mind, almost no matter what level you're at, especially at lower levels to some degree too, because if you think about your pieces and the harmony of a position, it's like in this position, your knight is good, your bishops are good. Why do you want to get rid of any of these pieces? The rooks are the two pieces that are not on their ideal square. So if you think about it, you think about squares, the advantages, it is something that I think can help you improve your game. So here Idani plays bishop takes knight, and now after rook takes bishop, if anything, white is better here because black has given up the bishop pair. White has a slight majority on the queen side with the 3-on-2 here, and at some point you even can go b3 and c4. And additionally, most importantly, black, if you could get something like f6 and e5 and build the central pawns like this, would have chances to create play and maybe even be better. But black can't easily do that here, because if you go f6, white can sack the rook, and after takes rook f c8, for example, now white has this move bishop to a6, and all of a sudden your rooks are very, very discombobulated. If you play rook e8, knight c7, white wins back one of the rooks. If you go rook c6 here, now white can play knight d4, rook c7, takes, bishop c4, creating the fossil, and after takes, rook a8, king f7. Many ways for white to win. Simplest probably just rook h8 here, and white has extra pawns. So Idani decides to trade here on a5. We get takes, rook a b8, and this is something that I think should be mentioned. Idani, when he plays bishop takes knight, this is about calculation. He thinks that he can trade off the bishop for the knight because these pawns on b2 and c3 will be too weak to defend, and it should lead to a simple draw. So we get b4, rook f c8, and now we have rook to e3. Idani goes knight to e4, pressuring the pawn on e4. Now we get knight to b5, a very good move, guarding the pawn on c3, and now your a7 pawn is very weak. Now, to his credit, Idani continues to find very good moves. This move knight d2, attacking the bishop on f1, is very good, because after knight takes a7, knight takes bishop, king takes knight, rook to c7, this knight on a7 is a little bit stranded. If you go knight b5, there's bishop c4 check, winning the knight, and so temporarily at least this knight on a7 looks very iffy. So Magnus plays king g1, sidestepping any checks on the light squares. We get this move bishop to c4, rook to e5, bishop d5. We get knight to b5 being played here, not rook to e3, because again, Magnus here needing to win this game to try and win the title. So Magnus goes knight b5, we get rook to c4, f3 played here, guarding the pawn on g4, creating this nice little mini pyramid, and white hopes to bring the king to the center. Idani plays bishop c6, pressuring the knight, which guards the pawn on c3. Magnus plays knight d6, rook takes pawn, rook c5, we get rook takes rook, and now a big mistake with this move bishop d5. Now you're probably wondering, as you look at the eval bar, why are you saying this is a big mistake? Now, one thing that's really, really important, and something that I think Magnus understands a lot better than most players, is that just because an endgame is equal or drawish does not mean it's going to be a draw in human play. If the moves look very easy to a computer, that's because the computer is 3500, but humans in practical play cannot find all the moves that computers can. So like if Magnus is playing a computer here, a computer draws this game easily, does not break a sweat, not that it could, but it would draw easily 100 times out of 100. But in human play, that is not the case. Now, the reason I say that is that here, what Idani should have played was this move bishop to a4, keeping pressure on the pawn on b4. Because if white goes b5, now you can play rook b6, pressuring the knight and the pawn at the same time. And white actually pretty much has to force a draw here with check, king g7, knight e8, king f8, and after check, back and forth, game will be a draw. But probably Idani might have seen a ghost here, might have thought, well, in this position there's some fossil like knight c7, knight d6, rook a8. You can kind of see the boogeyman here or there, and it doesn't matter whether it's Magnus or another player, but humans tend to see certain things. You see these ghosts, you get afraid of some idea or some discovery or something of that nature, whereas computers are cold-hearted killers, and they do not see it's not that they don't see it, they don't even get afraid because they see perfectly. They have perfect vision. They will see that there's no threat whatsoever. Why are you afraid of a discovery? What's the big deal? But the human element, the human psychology, the emotions, worrying about tactics, all these things do come into play. And so when Idani does not play bishop a4 and he now goes bishop to d5, after this move b5, the line to save the game and draw here is extremely thin for black. Now a computer would say just go king f8, what's the big deal? And after say rook c7, for example, you just go f5, followed by rook b6 pressuring the knight, and the game should end in a draw. But in human play, it's very hard to do this because when you look at this just optically, your king is cut off on the back rank. White's got this great knight, great rook, all kinds of threats here. You feel like intuitively something bad is about to happen, but a computer just laughs in your face and says, easy draw. I play perfect moves, I draw. What's the big deal? So Idani instead plays this move rook to b6. Magnus goes knight c8. We get rook to b8 back, which is a big mistake. What he should have played was rook b7, but nonetheless, after king to f2, it's very hard for black to play because if you go king f8 and king e3, you'll notice that the king here on f8 is a little bit cut off. You can't go to e7 because of the knight, and if you go to e8, there's knight d6, which forks the king and the rook. So in this position, black would have to play rook b8, but now after king d4, white's king is super close to this outside b pawn, and I think in human play, there's no way that you could draw this position. So Idani instead plays rook b8, thinking here that after knight e7, king f8 takes. If Magnus plays rook takes d5, now you can go king to e7, and after king f2, king e6, rook c5, you have king d6, back, the pawn on b5 is very weak, and the game should simply end in a draw. So this is what Idani's thinking. Okay, I give up the pawn here, but king gets active. It's a classic rook and pawn endgame. It's a draw. But no, not so fast, because here Magnus makes a beeline for the center with king f2. Very simple idea of running the king to d4. And at this point, the computer says the position is completely lost, in spite of the fact that it's even material and it is a rook and pawn endgame. So we get rook to a8. We have king e3 being played here by Magnus, understanding that it's very important to bring the king to the center as quickly as possible to escort this b pawn down the board. We have rook to a2, king to d4 is played here. Now computer doesn't love this move. It thinks that after g3 white is completely winning here, but nonetheless king d4 makes sense because what Magnus realizes, this b pawn is the road to victory. This is the pot of gold at the end of the road, or at the end of the rainbow, and he knows that he needs to push p. So we get rook takes g2 from Idani. Now Idani very low on time. Maybe rook d2 would have given him some chance to survive after king c3 and rook to d1, but with limited time, very hard to play this move. So he takes on g2. We get king takes d5, h5 played here. Idani desperately trying to create some counterplay by creating the passed h pawn, but unfortunately for him, it is a little bit too slow. We get b6. Rook to b2 is played here. We have the move king to c6, guarding the pawn on b6. Now we have h takes g4 played by Idani. He could have played h4 too, by the way, but after b7, if you play h3, now there's rook b5, creating the bridge here, and after check, king b6, white will push the pawn on the next turn and get a queen with check. So Idani decides to trade the pawns, takes, and goes king e7, hoping that he can create a pass pawn on the f pawn in time, but it is simply way too slow. Magnus goes b7. We get rook takes pawn. Again, black really has no way of stopping this classic bridge here, and you're probably wondering, what do I mean by a bridge? Now, one of the old lines that's been known for many years, I would say hundreds of years, and I've even done videos on this, is what we call the classic Lucena position, which is a situation with the rook on b5 and the pawn on b7. Normally the way this occurs is you get some position like this where the king is here, and at some point you put the rook, let me just put it here for example, you bring the rook up to, you cut the king off by 2 rows, so the king is 2 rows away from the pawn, and then you bring this rook up to the 4th rank, and after rook c1 you slowly ziggy zaggy here, you go here, check, you go here, check, king here, check, and you build the bridge with the king and the rook, and you push the pawn to make a queen. Additionally, if black leaves the rook here, say you go rook b2, now you move up 1 row, create the bridge on the 5th rank, push the pawn, and win the game. And this has been known for, I think, about 500 years now. So that's why when I refer to this technique with rook b5 as the bridge, it's based off the standard rook and pawn versus rook endgame, but those themes apply to all sorts of different rook and pawn endgames. So after b7, we get rook takes pawn, king takes rook, king e6 played here. Idani hoping that he can get some position like this with f5, where basically he can start pushing the pawn, run the king down the board, and make a draw. Unfortunately, after king to e6, Magnus plays this move g5, and here Idani resigns, because if he plays the move f5, for example, white can check the king. You go forward, after takes, rook f6, rook f8, white will just push the pawn down the board and win the game. And if you go king to f7, I can go rook f6, king g7, bring the king back with an extra rook on the board. It's a very easy win. So after g5, Idani resigns this game. That means that Magnus moves to a score of 9 points out of 11. Now Magnus would slow down in the final 2 rounds, rounds 12 and 13. He would draw against Norbek Abdusattorov in round 12, talented Uzbeki junior, and he would also draw in round 13 against Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha from India to finish the event on a score of 10 out of 13. Now, that would be good enough to win the World Rapid Chess Championship because the next closest competitor was Vladimir Fedoseev, who finished on 9.5 points out of 13. He had a very, very good finish. He beat both Nihal Sarin as well as Vidit Santosh Gujarati to finish the event. I believe he got clear second, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, I haven't looked at the standings super precisely, but nonetheless, the victor yet again is Magnus Carlsen. He defends his title and the World Rapid Championship. I believe it, if you count the World Rapid and Blitz on top of the Classicals, that would be his 16th World Championship. So it's nothing but an amazing feat from Magnus, a very deserved victory. He won a lot of games, did not lose any games, very, very stable throughout, and he won when it mattered most. And many of these games that he won also were in some of his patented end games. He got a lot of end games. He was able to grind his opponents. He was able to show better technique. So a very, very deserved victory for Magnus in the rapid portion. Tomorrow, the Blitz portion will begin. I will obviously be doing some recaps of that as well. But for now, I think we bask in the glory that is Magnus Carlsen and a great victory for him once again. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the World Rapid Chess Championship being held in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button below. And I will be back tomorrow with another great recap from the Blitz portion of the event in Uzbekistan. See you guys soon. Bye.